In deep time, when the solar system was young, Mars was a planet much like our own. Oceans, atmosphere, and a dynamic magnetic field, a complex environment attesting to all the attributes that support life. But we'll get back to that later, about 3 billion years later, when Mars is a desiccated husk, a pale russet relic of its former glory. Mars is among the brightest objects in the sky, tracing a great loop through the constellations and through history. When mankind first walked upright and freed his hands in the service of civilization, he looked up from the toils of the earth and surveyed the heavens, taking particular heed of the Red Wanderer. Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers Euphrates and Tigris. This moist alluvial soil was the cradle of civilization. Ancient man was a myth maker, believing that mysterious beings animated the natural world. These cosmogonies go back further than antiquity, back to the Neolithic era, the last phase of the Stone Age. In the southern region of Sumer, where the rivers meet, at the Garden of Eden, history was born. Here were the first writings, the first laws, the first wars, and the first kings. By 2900 BCE, there were scores of independent nations. Among them were rivalries and alliances, friendships and conflicts. Also, a bewildering number of deities. In their widespread pantheon, Nergal is the son of the sky god Enlil and the earth goddess Ninlil. He is the god of scorched earth and burning skies. His bloodlust colored much of Mesopotamian history. Standard iconography depicted Nergal as a lion. Sorry, C.S. Lewis, but it's been done. Nergal was prominent in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where he opens the earth and brings forth Enkidu to meet the other half of his very soul. While the earth is breached, Nergal tears out the remaining posts and releases a deluge upon the realm of the living, and only one family is allowed to survive. He is a god more feared than worshipped, the father of all forms of violence and disease, the god of inflicted death. When Nergal sought dominion over the underworld, he summoned a legion of demons, each named for a disease, and began his assault on the abode of the dead. He stormed the 7 gates of hell and passed through to the afterlife, posting 2 demons at each gate. They were the guardians of the dead. At last he reached the inner chamber of Ereshkigal, the queen of the underworld, where he intended to cut off her head. But instead, she takes a seductive bath, and they have sex for 6 full days. On the 7th day, they marry, and for a time, Nergal loved Ereshkigal more than he loved violence. Nergal gained access to the Tablets of Wisdom, wherein he learned that Marduk continued the work of creation by making the stars, the constellations, and the stations of the great gods. In 2334, one ruler dominated the land, Sargon the Great, who had Moses-like beginnings. Sargon was not content with local wars. He sought to conquer the known world and assembled a standing army. He built the first empire that oversaw a vast area of many cultures, many languages, and many gods. He credited all the victories of his dynasty to Nergal. The new Mesopotamia was unique in scale and organization. They standardized weights and measures and streamlined trade over great distances. As they matured, they perceived connections between the observable forces in nature and the personalities of their various gods. In their astral theological system, Nergal, the fiery god of war and pestilence, was associated with the planet Mars. When in bright opposition, Nergal brings misfortune. When dim, Nergal favors victory. The gaps in their natural understanding necessitated a constant intercourse among the gods. For privacy, they needed some special place to dwell. Let's call it the heavens. By 1900, the Amorites assimilated into Mesopotamia and built the city of Babylon. King Hammurabi, the greatest ruler of the Babylonian Amorite dynasty, came to the throne as its 6th king. He emulated the great Sargon by warring against neighboring kingdoms. Soon, Hammurabi's empire stretched from the Persian Gulf to Syria. He erected monuments in all his cities, each with 282 legal edicts. The Code of Hammurabi regulated his subjects in civil, criminal, and commercial matters, imposing the guidance of the state, from the maintenance of slaves to libel suits, from marital infidelity to property rights, from prices to wages. Hammurabi beseeched Nergal himself to lay waste any who would condemn his laws. Nergal was the destroying flame and the judge of souls. Babylonia competed for power with a Semitic tribe of the north, the Assyrians, who had occupied the region for 5 millennia. Assyrian hymns depict Nergal as a god of hunger, fever, and devastation. As empires got bigger, they became more ruthless, and the balance of power underwent remarkable shifts. King Ashurnasirpal II was an intensely militaristic ruler, setting the standard for future warrior kings of Assyria. By 860, his kingdom extends north to the Mediterranean Sea, but in the south, Babylon remained an elusive prize. For a century after his death, all Assyrian kings lusted after Babylonia. In 722, Sargon II is accompanied into battle by Nergal himself. Under his rule, the Assyrians completed the defeat of the Kingdom of Israel. In 704, King Sennacherib placed his eldest son on the throne in Babylon, but the Babylonians held their own ideas on how to live, and in 694, the Assyrian prince is murdered. Sennacherib is enraged and leads his armies to Babylon. He decimates its towers and desecrates its temples. Back home, his people were horrified by his actions against their cultural progenitors and feared the wrath of Nergal himself. Upon his return to Assur, Sennacherib was murdered by his own family, who toppled a solid stone statue of Nergal onto him, pulverizing his fragile human form. His youngest son, Esarhaddon, the leader of the coup against him, succeeds to the throne. He immediately begins to rebuild the ruined Babylon, funding the reconstruction with the spoils of his conquests in the west, in Canaan, where Nergal made a neat fit with Moloch, the local god of child sacrifice. He was one of the poster boys for the evils of idolatry throughout the Old Testament. When Esarhaddon dies, his son Ashurbanipal inherits the vast tract of empire between Egypt and Persia. King Ashurbanipal is Mesopotamia's most cultured ruler. He collected all the literary works of his empire and stored them in his palace at Nineveh. Over 20,000 cuneiform manuscripts were housed in the world's first library, where the priestly class chronicled the beliefs of mankind. Their religion was a living, evolving thing, and they sought to organize into some coherent system the numerous and often conflicting traditions that gained currency in various regions. Among the scriptures were 300 omen texts that offered prophetic visions. When Nergal's heavenly aspect becomes faint, the kingdom will encounter misery. In 605, King Nebuchadnezzar II ushered in the Neo-Babylonian period. He established his reign over a unified Mesopotamia and moved the center of government to the rebuilt city of Babylon. It became the grandest metropolis in the ancient world, straddling both banks of the Euphrates. In Nebuchadnezzar's magnificent palace were the fabled Hanging Gardens, displaying plants and animals from the far reaches of his empire, showing the scale and range of his conquests, a living testament to his vast power. Graven images of Nergal were placed at the batteries of their cities, where they were trusted to protect against the lions that roamed the devastated land. Abraham, son of Terach, migrated to Canaan and carried with him the legends of his nativity. The year 600, in the remote land of Judah, King Jehoiakim decided not to pay tribute to Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar marched west, invading Jerusalem and exiling its ruling class, who, during their captivity in Babylon, were able to study the root elements of their own traditions. Upon their return to Jerusalem in the post-exilic period, they further adapted and modified their religion. Ezra, Isaiah, Ezekiel, and the other Jews of the Restoration were not the composers of their narratives, but mere compilers of the earlier traditions of their race. Nergal is admonished in the Hebrew Bible as the deity of the city of Cutha. This center of worship was kept in repair by all Semitic rulers until just centuries before the coming of the Christ. During Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Babylonian arts, science, and literature flourished under the considerable support of a strong, wealthy state. Civilization, however, does not abide within the walls of brick and stone, but in the ideals spread beyond their confines and beyond their time. Viewed across the modern plains of Iraq, Uruk, the world's first city, the place of Genesis, looks like a great source of energy whose power is exhausted, a fallen giant gone back to the conditions it held in the beginning. History here has not come to its end, but to its starting point. The Greeks, a people glorious and arrogant, the very men and women who laid down the framework of democratic civilization during the most extraordinary 2 centuries in history, a time that saw the flowering of science, politics, literature, philosophy, drama, art, and architecture, the likes of which humanity still strives to equal. All this against a backdrop of war and conflict. Greece was a land of great plains riven by mountain ranges, dividing the people into multitudes of tiny nations. As Plato said, Greeks are scattered like frogs around a pond, a fragmented world unlikely to give rise to any greatness. Other cultures of the day grew around rivers and fertile plains, united by common resources. There was Egypt to the south, with a civilization already 2,000 years old, pulsing to the surges of the Great Nile, and Persia to the east, the birthplace of mankind, where the first cities were built. Greece was centered in a Mediterranean peninsula known as Hellas. Among the city-states was the ancient Argos, whose citizenry traced their lineage back to the Greek mythical period, and Corinth, who dominated shipping and the seas, ferrying goods and gods to and from Egypt, Assyria, and Italy. Sparta in the south, whose males were raised to be soldiers, their lives structured around discipline and war. And then there's Athens, a third-rate city built against an acropolis, a steep base outcrop of solid rock. The Athenians were common farmers and tradesmen, ruled by wealthy families with elite backgrounds. The origins of their fortunes were curious stories of godhood, half lost in myth. Life expectancy was under 15 years for the working class and over 30 years for the aristocrats. This was no society of equals, but a world riven by injustice. A whole country in the hands of a self-interested few, hardly a state on the verge of building an empire. Throughout this vast range of competing interests in the Hellas Peninsula were allowed the safe passage of the traveling bards, whose news, lore, and prophecy was visited upon all the land, the islands, and beyond. They crossed the plains, climbed the mountains, and sailed the seas, reciting the poetry of gods and men. The most enduring of these tales are the Iliad and the Odyssey, the first written record of ancient Greece, composed by the legendary Homer in a state of divine madness when the Muses entered the poet and rendered the words of the gods with clarity and beauty. The word Aries is an ancient abstract noun that means the throng of battle. Formulaic expressions such as to stir up sharp Aries or to kill through Aries are found throughout the literature of the ancients. The word is then spoken into being, and Aries becomes the god of war and the spirit of battle. He is the son of Zeus and Hera, one with the Olympians and detested by nearly all of them. They labeled him a bastard of foreign origin, probably from Thrace. He embodies the most distasteful aspects of brutal warfare and senseless slaughter. All men killed in battle were slain by Aries, and their blood served to glut the god. Bronze will clash with bronze, and Aries will redden the land with blood. Ironically, Aries, the god of war, is an inept strategist, and his appearances on the battlefield are often inglorious. In human conflicts, Aries chose his champions capriciously, and midterm switched sides. He merely took pleasure in wholesale bloodshed and wanton destruction, marching from realm to realm, haphazardly reversing fields and personifying the indiscriminate carnage of war. Unlike Ares, the cool-headed Athena used reason as part of her arsenal. In the Iliad, when Athena leads the battle cry from Athens, Ares roars like a dark storm from the Trojan citadels. Athena then proceeds to outmaneuver Ares at every turn, and finally guides the spear of Diomedes toward Ares himself, causing divine blood to flow. Ares flees to Olympus to howl and lick himself. Zeus addresses the shameless Ares.
You are the most hateful to me of all the gods who hold Olympus. Strife is forever dear to you, and war and slaughter.
This is typical of the Greek attitude toward Ares. He was not, however, entirely loathed among the immortals. He is accompanied into battle by his sister Eris, and his ancient consort Enyo, the goddess of battle who allowed Ares to take her work to the next level. Also in attendance were his two terrific sons, Phobos and Deimos, who drove his war chariot. Behind this consortium of hellions, the earth streamed with blood. While Hades didn't particularly like Ares, he recognized that he was good for business in the underworld. And Aphrodite, goddess of love, held a perverse passion for Ares. After much suspicion, her husband, Hephaestus, constructed a ruse to bring the pair in flagrante delicto. He ensnared them in the act and summoned all the gods of Olympus to witness their abasement. Humiliated and embittered, Ares disguised himself as a boar and slew Aphrodite's beloved, Adonis. Unplacated by blood, the madness of Ares creates the horrible serpent of Thebes that was slain by Cadmus, who sowed the dragon's teeth in the bountiful earth and gave rise to the Thebans, descendants of Ares. Back in Athens, on a foothill below the Acropolis, is a temple court known as the Areopagus, the Hill of Ares. At this site, Ares himself stood trial by the gods for the murder of Halirrhothius, son of Poseidon. In the subsequent world of men, this site serves as the seat of the Areopagus Council, the oldest court of Athens. In 561, a nobleman rode into Athens with a tall, luminescent woman. He introduced her as the goddess Athena, the patron deity of the city. She then endorsed him as ruler, and the Athenians accepted. Pisistratus became the first sovereign of Athens. In gratitude, Athena created the olive tree. He undermined the aristocratic hierarchy by appealing to common Athenians. He reduced taxes and doled out grants. Agrarianism was accelerated. Olive oil, with all its uses, became a valuable commodity. Athens was ideally situated in the middle of an extraordinary grouping of civilizations. Prosperity ensued, and Athens is transformed into an international power. In 527, when Hippias takes reign, the Athenians discover the perilous nature of tyranny. The paranoid dictator suspected a threat from his fellow aristocrats, and he was right. Cleisthenes assembled a conspiracy and banished him forever. And no sooner was he in power when Isagoras turned to the Spartans for support in a bloody coup. They seized control of Athens and ruled from the top of the Acropolis. The Spartans were ruthless expansionists, reducing conquered people to a slave class. If anyone looked like they might build an empire, it was the Spartans. But the bronze race of man loved the lamentable works of Ares and deeds of violence, and they were destroyed by their own hand. In the strange days that followed, the people were recalled to life, and Athens was rocked by an extraordinary event. Like their mythical heroes, the ordinary citizens took their destiny in their own hands, just as the traveling bards had instructed. They rose up in revolution and climbed the Acropolis, battling their Spartan overlords. For the first time in history, the people turned against their masters and seized power for themselves. In the new dawn, Cleisthenes was recalled from exile and named the first Archon. He carved out a great meeting place on an Athenian incline. Here, in the shadow of the Acropolis, citizens of Athens could give themselves voice. On these steps, commoners and aristocrats addressed their fellow man and proclaimed their ideas. They instituted a system of government known as democracy, and set this tiny city-state on the path toward empire. When Aries appears bloody and bright in the night sky, it is called opposition, when Mars attains its greatest brilliance and most startling retrogrades. All religions have a mythology, rich and fascinating, the innermost chronicles of mankind, an unraveling of the human psyche. In prehistory, a Neolithic population calling themselves the Racina emigrated from the coast of Anatolia to the lush hills of central Italy, where they became known as the Etruscans, who built towns on high hills enhanced by steep battlements. They mined copper and iron. Their metalwork trade gained them a position of influence in the Italian peninsula and led to an institution of aristocracy. In their theology, all phenomena were manifestations of divine powers. They had a mess of lower deities who were ruled over by the high gods of the Indo-European system. The Etruscans had a significant military tradition, raiding neighboring areas to gain territory and resources. They were loosely organized and had similar politics, but somehow never united to form a confederacy. Around 1500 BCE, a small band of Italic Latini, a primitive proto-tribe, settled in the tough backwoods along the river Tiber. These were the first Romans. There were three major gods in their religion: Jupiter, Quirinus, and Mavors, the archaic triad. The Romans had everything to learn from the Etruscans, and learn they did. Engineering that drained marshes and channeled water, architecture that laid out the forum, shipbuilding, marine technology, and navigation. Also, a lax theology of largely insignificant gods. By the 6th century, they emerged from their mythic past and into the world of recorded history. The student surpassed the teacher, and the Romans laid waste to the Etruscan citadels and defamed their memory. Romans vowed never again to live under a king and laid down the foundations of a representational government. In 509, the Republic is born. One by one, neighboring settlements fell to the Roman legions. Rome was a juggernaut on its course toward empire. Early Romans celebrated the mighty gods of nature and the homely gods of domestic life. Their gods were known merely as those that are above, or the noumena, vague in outline and lacking any beauty, drama, or stateliness. Though these Romans were deeply religious, they had little imagination. As their interests turned from farming to war-making, the ancient Roman agricultural god Mavors was syncopated to Mars, the god of war. The first month of the Roman year in the pre-Julian calendar was named March, which signified Mars' provision of agricultural renewal and the season of military campaigns. The field of Mars lay outside the gates of the ancient city. There the Romans assembled under arms to practice their skills of war. By now the Romans mastered the arch and used it to span an empire. In 229 they entered Greece and were eager to absorb the beautiful and poetic Greek pantheon. The Romans regarded foreign gods as having power over the people who worshipped them. By bringing them to Rome and housing them in splendor, they transferred their power to the empire. Aphrodite became Venus, and Aries became Mars. Rome was an engine of raw power, enforcing the rule of the Pax Romana, creating a level of organization unheard of in the ancient world. When Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon and captured his own capital, he became the Pontifex Maximus, the high priest of Rome, and religion was ripe for exploitation. It was a consolidation of power and a new theology, one which the Roman citizen was wise to acknowledge. On his birthday, the 12th of Quintilis, every Roman city offered sacrifice to the Caesar. Moreover, the month was renamed July. Omens and oracles were invented for political advantage, and the line between empire and religion became indistinct. Power and paranoia went hand in hand in Rome, and on the Ides of March, year 44, the senators murdered Caesar, and his chariot ascended to the heavens. The ensuing decades of civil war decadence, and greed led the patricians of Rome to trade a dictator for an emperor. Julius Caesar's nephew Augustus reigned over the golden age of Rome. The Pantheon, the home of the stolen gods, became the religious heart of Imperial Rome, now called the Eternal City. Emperor Augustus, through a rigorous program of religious renewal, encouraged the idea of his own divinity and attuned the forces of Roman worship toward himself. He cracked down on dissent and punished immorality, forcing a return to traditional Roman family values. The poet Ovid was banished to a remote province on the Black Sea. Virgil, however, was fired with enthusiasm for the new world order. He wrote the Aeneid to exalt the empire and invent a national hero for the race, destined to enthrall the world. The Roman goddess of war is Bellona, based on the Greek Enyo. The new Mars was not the mean, whining deity of the Iliad, but resplendent in shining armor. The warriors of the Aeneid rush on death and rejoice to fall on Mars' glorious field of renown. In the new Pax Augusta, war was the noblest and most glorious of human activity. The historian Livy set about creating a Roman ideal based on the Stoic virtues of valor, loyalty, and sacrifice. He searched Rome's past, relying on tales handed down over centuries. He finds out the stories of ancient Rome were short on Stoic virtues and long on murder, rape, and other mayhem. The legends told of Juno, the ancient Roman goddess who gave birth to Mars without the aid of her brother Jupiter, using instead a flower with fertile properties provided her by Flora, a minor deity of the spring. Amulius, the last king of Alba, usurped his brother Numitor. Amulius then prevented his niece, Rhea Silvia, from marriage and royal ascendancy by making her the first Vestal Virgin. But the adolescent Mars lusted for her, and despite her celestial status, he raped her. When she bare twin sons, Amulius had them thrown into the Tiber. For violating her vows, Rhea Silvia was condemned as a fallen priestess. The infants, Romulus and Remus, were rescued by a she-wolf, who nursed and raised them. They grew up filled with the ferocious spirits of their wolf mother and war god father. They led their people to the bend in the river, where they determined to erect a city. Romulus favored construction on the Palatine Hill, while Remus preferred the Aventine. So they fought, and Remus was slain. Rome got its namesake and first king, Romulus, sired by a god, suckled by a wolf, and bathed in his brother's blood, a fitting augury to the bloodshed and strife that lay ahead. The Rome of Romulus was shunned by its neighbors and in need of population. They opened themselves to outcasts, thieves, murderers, vagrants, and fugitives, all men. They were a desperate lot and eyed the comely daughters of the neighboring tribe of the Sabine. They lured them with the pretense of celebration and lulled them with a wine-soaked festival. Then, at a moment, Romulus and his city of men bared arms and captured the Sabine females and drove off the males. The grim stories of the early Romans were surprising to Livy. To his dismay, they echoed the cruel reality of the Rome of his day. Indulgence had brought them through every form of sensual excess, and they were morbidly attracted to death in all its forms. He saw it as a cultural curse, a destiny ordained by the original sin of the founder. The whole Roman psyche was based on violence, and their fate was to destroy themselves. But on the bright side, the fables made the origin of the city more august by uniting human and divine actions. Romans declared themselves sacred by claiming ancestry from Mars himself. In 476, Emperor Romulus Augustus, bearing the names of both the first king of Rome and the first Roman emperor, was ironically the last of the imperial rulers. The Western Roman Empire collapsed, ushering in the Dark Ages. For thousands of years, Mars was a blood-red dot among the starry host. Along the Nile, the Egyptians called it Hor-Deshur, the red one, the one who moves backward. The Babylonians knew it as the Star of Death, and never attempted to explain its looping movements. The Greeks had a more rational perspective and identified the fiery one as a wandering star. Based on the 5 elements, Far Eastern cultures called her the Star of Fire. In ancient Hindu myth, Mars is near Sima, the man-lion. The Aztec knew it as Huitzilopochtli, the destroyer of people and civilizations. Its retrograde motion fascinated the stargazers of the ancient world. The trajectory of Mars symbolized the violence and uncertainties of existence. In the 4th century, Eudoxus of Cnidus created his model of the universe according to the Platonic ideal. In 330, Alexander the Great returned from Babylon with a wealth of astronomical records and asked his teacher, Aristotle, to develop a new theory based on the old models. Aristotle wrote De Caelo, a monumental work on the heavens based on one fundamental flaw, an Earth-centered universe. In 140 CE, Claudius Ptolemy's system stripped the Aristotelian model of its symmetry in an attempt to explain the complicated motions of the heavenly bodies. His book, Almagest, would be the basis of astronomy for the next millennium. The geocentric solar system became overwritten continually with ever more intricate epicycles. 313, Emperor Constantine was convinced that a new god guided him in battle. He instigated the ascendancy of Christianity, which became the state religion, and he made Rome its center of worship. The Christ's blood would renew the world and save the cleansed souls of his believers. The scholars of the great Library of Alexandria fled to the east, but Constantine found them out in Byzantium and converted them to Christianity. In a victory lap, the city is renamed Constantinople. The destruction of knowledge was underway, and in 439 the Theodosian Code goes into effect, and the early Christians of Rome use their new freedom with a vengeance, and systematically destroy all remaining literature of the Etruscans, including the Tragetic books housed in the Temple of Apollo. The Christ becomes a servant of the state and rose to prominence on the back of its military might. Rome would become a holy city dedicated to the new god, as well as a graveyard for the old gods. In the Middle Ages, Thomas Aquinas was a particularly speculative and thorough theologian, the doctor of the Church. The volume and depth of his work resists any attempt at easy synopsis. But let's try. Aquinas explored the very nature of God himself, in defense of Christian teaching. From this perspective, he used philosophical mechanics in the service of theology, reason and sacred knowledge combined. He supported Aristotle's view of a limited God, stating that the first cause could not make several worlds, and the Church erupts. A denial of a plurality of worlds meant the denial of God's omnipotence, restricting the bountiful hands of the Lord. In 1277, Pope John XI issued an edict proclaiming God's sovereignty over all the many worlds around us. Any dissent was dealt with by excommunication or worse. Luckily, Aquinas died 3 years earlier, and his soul was beyond the Church's reach. In 1514, Nicholas Copernicus reintroduced the heliocentric system. He challenged the Ptolemaic universe conceptually, mathematically, and philosophically. He placed the Sun at the center of our solar system and set the planets into motion around it. The art of learning was reawakened in Europe, and the Church was miffed. In 1543, on his deathbed, Copernicus published On the Revolution of the Heavenly Spheres, his seminal work on the heliocentric theory. In it, he explained Mars' retrograde movement as a mere reflection of Earth's own motion in its orbit around the Sun, solving the ancient puzzle of Mars reversals in the night sky. Occam's razor could shave no closer. The Church immediately placed his work on the Inquisition's index of prohibited books. But humanity was ready for enlightenment, and science began to replace Christianity as the focal point of European civilization. It was testable and tangible, more useful in every way. The scientific revolution began with astronomy, just as it had in ancient Babylonia. Since the dawn of man, we have looked to the stars for signs of advancement, believing that our destiny resides in the sky. Tycho Brahe, the last of the naked-eye astronomers, made surprisingly accurate calculations of the heavens. He assessed the position of Mars to within 4 minutes of arc. Brahe was, shall we say, not a Copernican. He cited the authority of Scripture in portraying the Earth as being at rest. He surmised a compromised position known as the Tychonic system, a geo-heliocentric universe in which the planets circle the Sun and the Sun, Moon, and stars circle the Earth. That appeased the Church, somewhat. After some unpleasantry with King Christian IV, he moved to Prague, where he promptly died, and left all his closely guarded astronomical secrets to Johannes Kepler. During the religious wars between the Christian sects, the young Kepler escaped from Austria and settled in Prague. There he used Brahe's observations of Mars to deduce his laws of planetary motion. In 1605, he published The New Astronomy, subtitled Commentaries on the Motions of Mars, wherein he devised his first 2 celestial laws and liberated the cosmos from the crystalline spheres of medieval astronomy. His answer was the ellipse, with the Sun at its foci. The Ptolemaic system was now completely collapsed. Every 26 months, Mars and Earth are aligned on the same side of the Sun. Since the invention of the telescope, all scientific observations of Mars have clustered during these periods of opposition. In 1616, Rome decided the heliocentric model was contrary to both philosophy and scripture. 1619, Kepler announced the discovery of the third law of planetary motion, the harmonic law, that held the key to the scale of the solar system. 1627, Kepler published his treatise on planetary motion. 1636, Francesco Fontana produced sketches of his observations, the first known drawings of Mars. 1659, Christian Huygens was the first to describe a surface feature on another planet. Careful tracking of this landmark led Huygens to conclude the rotation of Mars at a very Earth-like 24 hours. Mars was no longer a wandering light in the sky, but a world that could be brought into the realm of scientific measurement. In 1695, Huygens published Cosmotheoros, where he explained that conditions on Mars would be cooler than the Earth, and its inhabitants adapted to its environment. In 1719, Giacomo Maraldi began observational study of the Martian poles. In 1777, William Herschel calculated the planet's axis to the plane of its orbit and fixed the equinoctial point on the Martian ecliptic. The axial inclination was very nearly the same as the Earth's, and Herschel realized that Martian seasons must be analogous to our own. In 1783, he observed 2 stars occulted by Mars. As they approached the rim of the planet, he detected a faint but appreciable atmosphere. Herschel established the parameters that were to dominate the study of Mars for the next 150 years, placing our red neighbor at the center of exobiological speculation. Johann Schroeder constructed the mightiest telescope in all Europe, made with lenses ground by Herschel himself. In 1806, Schroeder finished a 985-page manuscript containing 231 graphs of his discoveries on Mars. Just then, Napoleon's imperial troops occupied Hanover, and his book did not go to print. In 1813, the retreating French army burnt the town of Lilienthal to the ground, destroying all of Schroeder's maps, papers, and books. But he managed to save his manuscript, and after a long odyssey, it finally reached the University of Leiden. In 1828, Wilhelm Beer and Johann Modler began surveying Mars through numerous oppositions, and in 1840 produced the first map of the Martian surface, putting the 4th planet within the framework of 19th century geographical understanding. In the century of the refractor, telescopes improved dramatically. Each opposition brought a trove of new drawings and reports from astronomers like Warren de la Rue, William Rutter Dawes, Richard Proctor, Nathaniel Green, Etienne Trouvelot, and Angelo Secchi, who, despite his association with the Vatican, believed in the plurality of worlds and the universe as an organism teeming with life. Vague suppositions are transformed into hard knowledge, and areography goes from speculation to science. In 1867, as the era of the great telescopes was beginning, Jules Janssen from the top of Mount Etna conducted the first spectroscopic analysis of Mars, claiming to detect water vapor in its atmosphere. The remains of his observatory attest to the dangers of getting too close to Etna. In 1877, Giovanni Schiaparelli recorded traces of features on Mars that lay faintly at the threshold between the visible and the invisible. Fleeting impressions that took geometric form. In the interest of brevity, he termed them canali, channels in his native Italian. His ghostly canals became a dominant motif, and areology entered a startling new phase. In the subsequent oppositions, Schiaparelli's representations went from strange to bizarre, as the canali germinated, multiplied, and spread into a complex tangle of pure lines. They became alarmingly profuse. In a wave of excitement and skepticism, many observers focused their refractors on Mars. Expectation created illusion, and canal sightings ran wild, and the sensationalist media ran even wilder. By 1890, obsessive analysis of canal-filled maps of Mars yielded messages. The most famous were the Hebrew characters that spelled El Shaddai, the very name of the Almighty. The opposition of 1892 was the most eagerly awaited in the history of Martian studies. In that month, Camille Flammarion published the first volume of his classic La Planète Mars, an ambitious compilation of every study of the red planet that had ever been made. His massively documented work accepted the maritime view of Mars, that the dark areas were seas, the light areas continents, and the reddish color from the alien vegetation. As for the canals, he concluded they were watercourses, cut by a human-like species with intelligence and methods superior to our own. 1894, Mars was a hot topic in Europe and North America. The heat was generated by certain astronomers who circumvented scientific procedure by writing popular books and courting the press with immediate reports of their observations. They were the bad boys of astronomy. Percival Lowell, a wealthy Bostonian, constructed an observatory in the clear, unindustrialized air of the Arizona Territory. Mesmerized by Darwinian theory and the now passé nebular hypothesis, Lowell announced his conclusions before ever putting eye to eyepiece. He envisioned a Mars whose geothermal engine had run down, a world on its way to utter desiccation, leaving its ancient race of inhabitants to build a vast system of irrigation canals to transport precious water from the melting polar caps, marshalling their dwindling resources to stave off extinction. Lowell's grand narrative of a biosphere in irrevocable decline and the tragic struggle of the heroic Martians created an immediate sensation and unleashed a firestorm of controversy. His observatory in Flagstaff produced 917 drawings during its first opposition. Though Lowell drew many lines, he could draw no line between what he saw and what he inferred. In 1895, he published his book, Mars. Lowell's account of the protracted tragedy on our neighboring planet and the gigantic feats of Martian engineering was taken by lay readers as scientifically sanctioned certainty of intelligent life on the red planet. The public's eager acceptance of all kinds of fantasies made Lowell a household name, and anathema to galled scientists everywhere. His fiercest critics were a trio of apostates over at the Lick Observatory, home of the largest refractor in the world. Its director, Edward S. Holden, castigated Lowell's reckless theorizing. In a splendidly reasoned article, he outlined the current state of Mars science, which was the following. Observations of the red planet enabled a fairly accurate map of the seasonally dark and bright regions, and neither land nor sea has been distinguished. In conclusion, he stated that scientific men are honor-bound to be scrupulously exact when drawing the line between certainty and speculation. Alas, poor Holden. He had a naive faith in the self-respect of a public that hungered for hyperbole. He also failed to reckon with Lowell's immunity to embarrassment. Lowell's appetite for celebrity grew even more ravenous. He set his sights on becoming the Magellan and Mercator of Mars. William Wallace Campbell pronounced Lowell a trial to sane astronomers. Campbell's spectrographic readings of the red planet failed to detect any evidence of water vapor. He suspected Jansen's results had registered the contents of our own atmosphere. Edward Emerson Barnard feared that an amateur like Lowell would tar the whole profession with his theatrics. While Lowell predicted the surface of Mars as entirely flat, Barnard's painstaking study of the Martian Terminator finds mountains and plateaus. Edward Walter Maunder, founder of the British Astronomical Association, saw the canals as tricks of the eye that led otherwise competent observers to simply connect the dots among discrete surface features, a mental summation of lesser details. For Maunder, the implications of a plurality of worlds was fraught with theological hazards that challenged the anthropocentric order of the universe.